in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, Australia Votes. My name is Matt Johnston and I'll be your facilitator today. Our presenter is CCIQ General Manager of Advocacy, Nick Behrens. Thanks for joining us, Nick.
Thank you, Matt.
As far as election campaigns go, the 2013 instalment will go down in history as a marathon. From the moment former Prime Minister Julia Gillard announced the election in the last week of January to polling day this Saturday, the campaign has had everything. Irrespective of the result, I think it's safe to say the state's business community will be just relieved to have some certainty around the future and will be hoping consumers share their views. Throughout the campaign, CCIQ's conducted in-depth analysis of each of the policies and the impact they will likely have on Queensland businesses. Thankfully, Nick is not electioned out just yet, and he's here today to run through those policies and take questions from you guys, the audience. Now, before we start, there's a couple of things that will help you get the best out of today's webinar. It'll last for around 30 minutes. We'll have a question and answer session at the end. Please remember to send your questions through as we go, though, so we don't have a flurry at the end. We'll endeavour to get to them whenever we can. Nick, let's get started, mate. Can you just take us through some of the initiatives that we've seen announced so far?
Thanks, Matt. It would be fair to say that we're all suffering a hefty degree of election fatigue. Indeed, if you recall, Julia Gillard in the last week of January called an election for the 14th of September, albeit that's been changed to the 7th of September to end up with one week less of electioneering. But elections are good and bad in that we know from history that consumers go into slow motion when it comes to federal elections, and this election has been no exception in that regard, in that unfortunately the business community has reported difficult trading conditions associated with uncertainty as a result of the federal election. But the flip side of the coin is that elections are always very good times for achieving outcomes for business and getting promises from the political parties. And again, this election has proven to be no exception in that respect. There's a good suite of policies from both the ALP and the coalition, but we believe that irrespective of who is elected, there's going to be some good policies in place to take the economy forward and enable small business and medium business to grow and employ. Prior to the election, CCIQ has continued to portray and action itself as being a balanced and bipartisan organisation. We called on the next federal government of Australia to deliver policies that would reduce government costs on business, to reduce government red tape on business, to introduce a fairer workplace relations system, and to address some of the infrastructure bottlenecks that exist within Queensland. Very pleasingly, there's a lot of boxes that have been ticked in those four areas, and I wish to take you through those now. Before we get into reducing government costs on business, I'd like to talk to you about the economy. And one of the common themes as part of this federal election, particularly for the ALP, is there's a number of legacy issues that the ALP have had to deal with. And unfortunately for the ALP, one of those legacy issues is their fiscal and economic management. In the last 6 years, there's been $222 billion in deficits that have been accumulated. They've time and again promised to deliver a budget surplus, but unfortunately those surpluses haven't been met. It's important to put it into context. Does Australia have a debt crisis? Well, by international standards, absolutely not. Indeed, Australia is one of the few countries in the OECD that has a AAA credit rating from Standard & Poor's and Moody's and the Fitches of the world. But it's important to also highlight that the fastest growing component of the federal budget is actually servicing that debt. $7 billion each year is really wasted on paying interest on the debt that has been accumulated by the federal government. So we're not yet at a crisis, but we certainly need to be taking measures today and in the short term to make sure that it doesn't become a crisis in the future, and that we are not leaving a legacy for future generations to pay down. And the point that we really make and have made in recent federal budgets, is that there's an embedded structural deficit that exists within the federal budget. Unfortunately, the federal government is quite simply spending more than it is earning, and business on a daily, weekly, annual basis has to balance its own books. It can't continue to run at a loss and ratchet up debt, and business believes that federal government should be no different. So the coalition has made some strong announcements historically about how it would balance the books. However, in the last several weeks, it really has shied away from putting a date in place as to when it would get the budget back into black. But it is truly committed to getting us into surplus, capping the debt limit at $3 billion. And similar to what the Queensland state government did, they're committed to putting in place a commission of audit to start to identify some savings and efficiencies to pay down that debt. And indeed, last Thursday, they identified $31.6 billion in budgetary savings that they will make. And I believe today that they are releasing their final costings for the federal election, and that's now up towards $40 billion. In terms of interest rates, this is an interesting one because interest rates are at a historic low. They're at 2.5%. Now, interestingly, the ALP takes the view that that's as a result of responsible economic and fiscal policy. They take pride in the fact that we're at 2.5%. Whereas the coalition really highlight that 2.5%, it's a historic low. It's actually beyond emergency levels. And if you are a business, obviously with debt, low interest rates is a good thing. But the Chamber has recently made some public comments that the very low interest rate that we have at the moment really is cementing a perception that the Australian economy is not performing as it really ought to. And given that the underperforming Australian economy really is as a result of confidence, low interest rates are just serving to reinforce that perception that we're not performing as well as we need to, and it's undermining confidence. So interest rates, it's interesting how both parties have a differing view on the same historic 2.5% official interest rate. In respect to jobs and employment, the ALP, their big headline initiative is the Plan for Australian Jobs, which is essentially $1 billion to support and improve Australian business procurement and help Australian businesses to take up tendering opportunities both within Australia and globally. They're also committed to putting in place some innovation precincts. The coalition have committed to generating 2 million new jobs over the next decade. That is largely through an economic policy that focuses on 5 pillars, being the manufacturing, innovation, advanced services, agriculture exports, education and research, and mining and resources.
And Nick, just before we move on, mate, I note that quite a few of the announcements we've heard from the coalition, and particularly they're looking at the 5-pillar economy, it somewhat mirrors the strategy, the election strategy that the Newman government carried into its win in Queensland. Do you think that's a conscious effort? Is it sort of a tried and tested method?
Yeah, look, we're very supportive of the state government in their 4-pillar strategy. They focus on tourism, building construction, agriculture and resources. We take the view that ultimately it's good to have a specific focus. It's good to, otherwise you really just got an unstructured, scattergun approach to your economic growth strategy. So it's good to be focusing on individual sectors that you believe are going to take the economy forward and generate that prosperity that is needed. But at the same time, there are a lot of businesses that are outside those 4 pillars in Queensland, and the coalition does have policies that extend beyond those 5 pillars, and so there is some rounding, but it is good to have a focused approach to how you believe you can help businesses grow and employ. I want to now start talking about what it is that both parties have committed to doing to alleviate government costs on business. Now, obviously, many small businesses, their income is simply treated as PAYG. The ALP, as part of the implementation of the carbon pricing mechanism through the Clean Energy Future Household Assistance Package, reduced income tax rates. They were going to have a second round of income tax cuts, but unfortunately they moved away from its implementation. Similarly, the coalition, well, they're committed to abolishing the carbon tax, but they're going to keep the actual compensation package that was associated with it. But similar to the ALP, they're not going to continue with the second tier or second round of those income tax cuts until they've actually got the budget back in surplus. Company tax. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the ALP unfortunately are being challenged by some legacy issues, and that's what we find with elections. You can't go into an election with a clean slate. You actually have to be held accountable to some of the policies and some of the things that you haven't followed through when they've been in government. And you really have had 6 years of the ALP being in government where they've done some good things, but unfortunately they've done some things that haven't met with business community approval. And the company tax rate is one of those examples in that the ALP promised the Australian business community that it would reduce the company tax rate from 30% down to 28%. They later changed that promise to be a reduction from 30% down to 29%, and in the end they totally walked away from that commitment and abandoned it, and it was a broken promise to the Australian business community. The coalition going into this federal election, well, they've committed to reducing the Australian company tax rate from 30% down to 28.5%. The estimated benefit of doing that is about $5 billion. It would benefit about 750,000 businesses. It's important to point out that it benefits not only the big end of town. Many small businesses have sought to structure themselves to become corporated to enjoy that benefit that exists between the company tax rate compared to income tax rates. Australia is at a competitive disadvantage when it comes to the company tax rate, where there's an OECD average of about 24%, we're at 30%. So the 1.5% reduction starts to grind away that competitive disadvantage, but it certainly doesn't remove it, and there's a long way to go. And it's also very important to bear in mind that there's some swings and roundabouts with this coalition announcement, in that for the big end of town, for those companies that have company tax income in excess of $5 million, they will actually have to pay a 1.5% company tax levy to fund the coalition's paid parental leave scheme. But there's a net number of businesses that actually experience a windfall from this initiative. So we think that it's a good policy, and it's a policy that perhaps more importantly generates business confidence, which are the precursors to businesses making the decision to employ and making the decision to invest.
Right, and mate, you did just touch on paid parental leave. It's probably been, particularly the Coalition's policy, one of the big talking points of the election. I know you've been quite outspoken in recent weeks about the state of the economy and whether or not that is feasible, that policy. Has that changed at all? Has the Coalition proven that is effective?
Yeah, look, there's a good slide later on, but the essential difference is that the ALP currently have a paid parental leave scheme at 18 weeks of the federal minimum wage, and so that's pretty much a little bit under $11,000 compared to the coalition proposal to potentially increase paid parental leave paid to mums up to $75,000. Now, one of the most important points to make is that paid parental leave is vitally needed. The Australian economy is going to experience significant, substantial structural adjustment in the coming years as the baby boomers retire. So we need those mums to be making the decision to have a child, but more importantly, we need those mums to be re-entering the workforce. So it is right to have a paid parental leave scheme, but ultimately we take the view of what is affordable. And we honestly believe that increasing it from $11,000, increasing it sevenfold up to $75,000 is unaffordable, and when you couple it together with the fact that the larger end of town actually has to pay for that increase through that 1.5% levy, we don't think it's a good decision. If you have to have priorities, I think there's some better priorities that could be identified, and we'll discuss those shortly. In respect to the minerals resource rent tax, the mining tax, well, obviously it's a key component of the ALP. They're going to retain the mining tax, whereas the coalition have sought to do away with it. Now, Queensland relies extensively on the resources sector. We all know that. Has the mining tax hurt the resources sector to date? Well, I think, given the fact that revenues associated with the mining tax haven't been as anticipated, the actual surface impact of that tax is probably not been significant. But what a lot of people don't take into account is that tax actually favours pre-existing established resource companies and actively seeks to discourage companies that are more juvenile in starting to explore and extract some of the resources. So it's not necessarily reducing the amount of resource currently extracted, but it's certainly impeding and deterring future exploration and extraction of the resource. And so ultimately, what impacts negatively on the resources sector in Queensland impacts on all of the business community, and we don't think that the mining tax is something that's in the best interest of Queensland. Unfortunately, though, in that the coalition, as part of the coalition's commitment to remove the minerals resource rent tax, it actually is removing the total package and piece of legislation that was implemented at the time. And there was a number of small business assistance measures that were tied to the minerals resource rent tax legislative package. And unfortunately, what will in fact happen is that some of that small business assistance will discontinue under the coalition. And we're talking about instant asset write-off. It's currently $2.9 billion in assistance paid to small businesses across Australia, and also accelerated depreciation for motor vehicles and tax loss carryback measures. Cumulatively, these things, there's significant assistance that's provided to small business, and it's not going to be in existence going forward. And this is where the ALP do get a tick. They're actually increasing the instant asset write-off from $6,500 up to $10,000 and renaming it the Small Business Investment Boost. So we actually think the ALP probably trumps coalition in this area. We're encouraging the coalition to perhaps rethink this policy and do away with the mining tax, but try and retain those initiatives. And one way that you could do that is, as we discussed, the paid parental leave scheme is perhaps not the priority that it should be. And we can identify these small business assistance measures as being a better and higher priority. The carbon tax, I think everyone's quite clearly aware that the coalition are seeking to scrap the tax. The ALP implemented the carbon pricing mechanism, and Kevin Rudd has said that they'll change the carbon pricing mechanism to an emissions trading scheme. That effectively results in the price on per tonne of emissions reducing from $24.15 down to about $6. They tie it to the European Union price, and the point to make there is that the European Union price is a floating price, and whilst it's currently at $6, pundits in that arena anticipate that it will inevitably grow to $30. And what we're essentially doing here is imposing a real competitive disadvantage on Australian industry. And it's really, Queensland businesses believe that they have to do the right thing by the environment. I think ultimately there will be an emissions trading scheme in existence in Australia, but it's about timing, and we don't think that Australia should be a first mover in respect to implementing an emissions trading scheme, when essentially the result is that we're shifting offshore Australian jobs. We don't want to get into the argument of climate change, but the fact is that Australia in net terms is only a fractional emitter of global emissions, and we don't think that Australian industry should suffer when our competitors such as North America and China and others aren't yet fully embracing their own responsibilities. So we support the Coalition's decision to scrap the carbon tax. Fringe benefits tax, again, it highlights, I guess, one of the business community frustrations with the recent federal government, in that when Kevin Rudd was reappointed Prime Minister, the day he was reappointed, he said he wanted to re-engage and rebuild the relationship with the Australian business community. But then the very next day, without any consultation to those that were impacted, he announced a change in the treatment of FBT on motor vehicles, and the effective result of that change is to disadvantage the Australian automotive manufacturing industry, Australian motor vehicle retailers, those employers that offer leased vehicles to their employees, those companies that deliver novated leasing, and individuals who had novated leases themselves. And it was really a very poor example of policy that has been strategically considered, and it was likened to policy on the run without any consultation. So again, the Coalition have sought to unwind that policy, which enjoys the support of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Excise on tobacco. Both the parties have signed off an increasing excise on tobacco. CCIQ thinks it's a good thing. The amount of the health budget that is devoted to treating individuals who are there because of tobacco use is significant, and there's a very strong nexus between business taxes and funding the healthcare system. So, all that we can to probably deter tobacco usage is a good thing, and would ultimately, the longer term view is that we support it. Tax reform in general, again, the ALP have to be assessed on what they've done to date. They had a real opportunity, and they enjoyed good support for a period of time, in that they committed to a review of Australia's future tax system that was known as the Ken Henry Review of Taxes. They made a number of recommendations to take Australia's tax system forward, but unfortunately very few recommendations were implemented by the ALP federal government. In contrast, there was a key sentence or sentences within Tony Abbott's budget in reply speech back in May this year, in that the Coalition are committed to finishing off the tax reform process, and we think that's a really vitally needed milestone that needs to be delivered for Australia. At present, we have 127 taxes at a Commonwealth, state and local government level. Only 10 of those taxes raise 90% of all tax revenue. So to spin that around, 117 taxes raise only 10% of all tax revenue, which is an example of the enormous inefficiency of Australia's tax system. So there is ample opportunity for us to be doing things better. We take the view that ultimately the goods and services tax should be included in the mix of consideration. For example, if you increase the GST from 10 to 12.5%, you generate enough revenue to remove payroll tax across Australia. Payroll tax is a tax on employment, and anyone with a sane mind would never put a tax on a job. Yet every state in Australia has a tax on a job at the present, and we don't think that's sensible. Again, it places Australia at a competitive disadvantage compared to our global competitors. So we believe that GST should be in the mix of tax reform. Ken Henry certainly recommended that there should be the implementation of a broad-based consumption tax that's consistent with GST ultimately being increased, or exemptions currently in place on GST being removed.
Okay, Nick, if we look at it from a parliamentary perspective then, do you think that it would be within the first term of a coalition government, should they opt to amend the GST?
So within 1 year, the coalition have sought to have a white paper on tax reform. But the reality is they then need to execute on the recommendations, and particularly for the GST, it will require not just the Commonwealth signing off on it, but all states signing off on it. So I think there really would need to be a very reasoned, well thought out argument as to why GST should increase. But I mean, it's important to point out that the GST is a vehicle to remove a lot of taxes, but it's not the only option that is available to us. So whether or not the GST ultimately changes, there's still ample opportunity for us to be more efficient about how we generate the revenue that is needed to deliver the services to the community. And one thing that I haven't articulated is, business does not begrudge having to pay tax. It's part of being in existence. But when you're at a competitive disadvantage with your global competitors, and when you're having to spend significant time and effort to understand your obligations, it blunts business from employing and growing. And so we think that there's ample room for improvement about how Australia's taxation system operates. Red tape. So the second pillar, I guess, in which the Chamber wanted from the federal government, from the next federal government, was reducing government red tape on business. There's some very good examples and initiatives that have been committed to from the ALP. They've committed to extending the superannuation clearinghouse from small business to medium-sized business. They're committed to addressing some of the red tape issues that arise from their own paid parental leave scheme. For example, at the moment, an employer has to remunerate the mum who's going off on paid parental leave and then seek reimbursement from Centrelink. What will now be the case is that Centrelink pays direct to the mum, removing the business requirement to be involved, which is essentially good for cash flow and good for alleviating paperwork. Another good announcement from the ALP is that they're going to, small business will no longer have to lodge a quarterly BAS statement. They can now lodge an annual BAS statement. But again, and frustratingly so, it highlights the inconsistency of the ALP in that they're doing something good with BAS in terms of taking it from a quarterly lodgement to an annual lodgement, yet with PAYG, they're taking it from a quarterly lodgement to a monthly lodgement. So you've got this policy inconsistency from the ALP in trying to alleviate red tape. Coalition, theirs is more higher level commitment to reducing red tape, in that they want to reduce the red tape burden in Australia by $1 billion each year. They're doing that largely through process, in that they're appointing a political champion, and then they're targeting each minister and department to reduce their own portfolio's regulatory burden by having a target that needs to be met. They're having 2 days in Parliament that are devoted to removing red tape, and they're doing a number of other process-driven initiatives. Workplace relations, the third pillar of what we're seeking from the next federal government. I think most listeners to this webinar will be acutely aware of the significant frustrations that businesses have with the Fair Work Act at present. Those frustrations relate to the high labour costs. We've had a federal minimum wage that has increased by a little bit over $4,000 in recent years. We've had penalty rates that are effectively leading to restaurants no longer opening on key trading days. Indeed, we did a little case study of restaurants up in Noosa and Hastings Street and Gympie Terrace, and two-thirds of those restaurants were closed on Easter Sunday and Easter Monday due to penalty rates. You've got the issue of inflexible working arrangements. We've lost flexibility in the workplace that has impeded productivity, that is impeding business profitability. Only recently we had the Reserve Bank Governor say that the Workplace Relations Act is impeding productivity in Australia. You have the re-implementation of go-away money through unfair dismissals. Businesses can no longer take the management decision. We've lost managerial prerogative in managing underperforming employees. And if you do want to, to get rid of an employee, you have to pay them go-away money, and we think that's wrong. You've got significant militancy from unions in Australia. The federal government really has pandered to a union overreach. You've got Fair Work Commission and Fair Work Ombudsman that don't seem to understand business and how business runs in Australia. And if you were to summarise all of that, and we'll talk about this much talked about pendulum of industrial relations, well, businesses overwhelmingly think that the pendulum of industrial relations has swung too far away from employers towards the employee. And we wanted the next federal government to centre that pendulum. We didn't want to go back to the dark. We didn't want to go back to those days of work choices. I think they are done and they're done. And no one wants to see that level of biasness in Australia's workplace relations arrangements. But we've gone from one extreme end of the spectrum to the other, and there really needs to be balance restored. Unfortunately, and listeners will be disappointed by this, in that the coalition obviously is a bit shy on workplace relations. It's announced a few minor peripheral changes, but in the main it is hinging its fortunes on a Productivity Commission review in 2015, and they will take the recommendations that fall out of that Productivity Commission review to the next federal election to get a mandate for change. So businesses are going to have to wait in excess of 3 years to start to see material change in Australia's workplace relations framework. Superannuation, ALP, increasing the super rate from 9 to 12%. We ultimately believe that businesses already do the heavy lifting when it comes to helping individuals achieve an appropriate retirement income. They already fund 9% or 9.25%. They already fund a suite of leaves. We believe that business does enough. The coalition, they're seeking to delay by 2 years the increase from 9.25% up to 12%. Ideally, we'd like to see them go all the way and move away from businesses having to fund that increase, and instead apportion that responsibility back on the individual. We believe that individuals should take take responsibility for their own appropriate retirement incomes, and it shouldn't be left to business to do that. Paid parental leave. Well, we had a good discussion about that earlier. The slide is there, and this presentation is sent to all the listeners, so you can examine that slide in more detail. But again, we just make the point that it's vitally needed. We're not convinced that there's a sensible argument to take the ALP scheme as it is to what is proposed under the coalition. Workforce skills and development. Just want to focus very quickly on this one, in that there's some good initiatives that have been announced by both the ALP and coalition to support those wanting to do a trade or a traineeship. The ALP largely focuses on the individual. The coalition too, they provide a little bit different in that they're providing a $20,000 HEC-style payment to an apprentice or a trainee. We would ideally like to see the coalition reverse the ALP's cut to employer incentive payments, which has recently been actioned by the ALP. And we believe that if they were to do that, it would obviously be a very powerful incentive for employers to take on an apprentice and trainee. And at the moment, those numbers, apprentice numbers and trainee numbers, they're in free fall. They're in free fall for a number of reasons. Primarily because of the economic state of play. But having said that, the cost of employing an apprentice and trainee has risen significantly because of industrial relations arrangements, and also at the same time, of course, the ALP has discontinued the employer incentive payments. Skilled migration. This is the final slide before we just quickly talk about infrastructure. The ALP have unfortunately sought to vilify employers who have a skill shortage. They've made it very difficult for employers now to access skilled migration. We believe that 457 visas in particular is an essential component of ensuring that Queensland workplaces have the essential skills that they need. Even though there's been a somewhat of an equilibrium in the labour market with unemployment growing, there are many businesses that continue to have specific skill shortages in occupations and skill shortages by region. There is an embedded lack of mobility of labour between the eastern seaboard of Australia and the west. And if you go out into remote rural regional Queensland, there continue to be a range of job vacancies that cannot be filled. Infrastructure, this is the last one that I want to talk about. And there's some good announcements here. We've highlighted the vital need to reinvest in the Bruce Highway. This is a national piece of infrastructure that delivers ongoing economic benefit to all of Australia. It is outrageous that there are flooding issues associated with a national highway. This highway closes on repeated occasions each year due to rain. There is a terrible safety record associated with the Bruce Highway, and there are now emerging capacity bottlenecks associated with the Bruce Highway. It requires significant investment, $4.1 billion from the ALP as opposed to 6.5 from the Coalition. They're both good amounts. I think the Coalition actually includes the upgrade of the Gateway Motorway, and you can see that below. Our second priority for infrastructure in Queensland was Toowoomba Second Range crossing. We believe that would really open up the southeast Queensland and unleash some of the economic opportunities arising from gas exploration in particular. It's unfortunate that the ALP haven't sought to commit to that one, but there's $700 million commitment from the Coalition there. Brisbane Cross River Rail, not yet a bottleneck, but will be in coming years as the population on the south side of Brisbane grows. Again, ALP committing to fund it. Coalition, well, they don't support Commonwealth investment in urban rail. They believe it's a state responsibility. NBN, well, there's a lot of talk. I think most listeners would be aware of the difference, but essentially the ALP, they're committed to the NBN. The Coalition is really the same infrastructure, but only taking it to the node or the curb in the street, and then relying on the existing copper infrastructure to deliver that infrastructure to the actual household. One is the Coalition is significantly less than the ALP, and depending on who you talk to, there's actually very differing opinions within the business community about what is needed there, and that essentially comes down to a tension that exists between future vitally needed infrastructure and affordability, and I can't explain it any better than that. Finally, CCIQ is not in the business of telling our listeners who they should vote for. We've mentioned the legacy issues that the ALP has. When we actually asked 200 of our members to compare the ALP policies with the Coalition's policies, and the slide in front of you at the moment, that is their scoring, not our scoring. But my personal view is those numbers pretty much align with, I think, the commitments on the table from both of the parties. So we're encouraging Queensland employers to talk to their employees about the issues that impact on business as part of this federal election. Ultimately, we believe that employer and employee fortunes are intertwined, in that the single greatest thing a business can do to help their employees is to offer secure ongoing employment, and by helping business, you're actually helping business to deliver secure employment, but enables that individual to have a livelihood. So we wish both the parties the best of luck on Saturday. I think it's a pretty clear picture that is emerging as what the result will be, and accordingly it will be of essential importance that whoever wins on Saturday to carry out an action and execute on the commitments that it has put in place. The election outcome has the enormous potential to benefit business. We we believe that there will be a surge in business confidence following the election, simply because the election campaigning is out of the way and that uncertainty is out of the way, but also because, as you've just seen, there's a really good range of policies that are on the table that will help business to grow and employ and take that economy forward. That's why promises need to be kept, and we'll be making sure that the coalition or the ALP keep those promises. So thank you, Matt. Back over to you.
Thanks, Nick. It's very informative, mate. We have got a few questions coming through here. One from Lisa on a very, very topical issue that you touched on briefly. What's CCIQ's opinion on the changes to temporary employer-sponsored subclass 457 visas? The legislation was obviously changed and it's made it more difficult for employers to sponsor overseas workers to Australia. Does CCIQ believe that allowing temporary sponsored workers into Australia benefits the country by assisting employers to fill positions that they're finding it difficult to fill, or do you believe that it takes jobs from Australians? Which it's a very good question because it's an argument that has been raised on many fronts.
Yeah, look, the position that we take is that skilled migration is an essential component of ensuring that Queensland workplaces have the skills and workforce that they require. Unfortunately, even with an increasing unemployment rate and you know, the resources sector shedding jobs and other businesses shedding jobs, there is an embedded lack of mobility between profession and between region. And the reality is businesses continue to have vacancies in specific niche occupations and in specific regions of Queensland. And the only option, the only realistic viable option on the table is skilled migration. And so that is why we believe that the recent changes from the federal government, they were terrible changes. They really sought to vilify they really sort of vilify those employers with skill shortages, and it was pandering to the unions who have got a philosophical objection to skilled migration, and it was almost scorched earth policy on behalf of the federal government. That package of reforms was raced through the dying days of Parliament. Debate was guillotined. We were not able to have considered, reasoned debate in Parliament on whether or not these were good changes, and it's a poor outcome. And unfortunately, we haven't yet got a commitment from the coalition to unwind them, but that unwinding needs to occur.
Right, Leanne has said, what influence will the Palm United Party, Katter and the Greens, what will their business policies do to the election? How will they affect it?
Okay, look, the way the polls are running at the moment, it's fairly clear picture in that there's going to be a clear majority win for the coalition in the House of Reps, and you know what I should say is a majority government, a clear majority government with a mandate to govern is in the best interests of the business community. Decisions that are made need to be born out of strategic approach as opposed to the populism, the politics of populism. And the minority government that we have had in place over the last 3 years really has been pandering to minority interests, you know, whether it be the Greens or independents, and we don't think that was in the best interests of Australia, and so we need a clear majority government. So, you know, CCIQ is committed to being non-partisan, and we actively engage with the ALP and the coalition, but we don't actually support you know, the minor parties, because the more you support those minor parties, the more likelihood there is that you will have a minority government, which is bad for business investment. It is just bad for business investment. Now, that's the House of Reps. It's unclear as to what the result in the Senate is going to be. It is unclear whether or not the coalition are going to have a majority in the Senate. And the Palmer Party in particular is looking like they're going to have material influence on whether or not that coalition is going to just nudge enough numbers to have a control in the Senate. Because if the coalition doesn't get control of the Senate, then it's there's no certainty associated with the legislative packages that will need to go through Parliament to action these commitments that we've heard earlier on. So yeah, Palmer Party in particular, they're going to have some sway this federal election.
Right, and we've seen some interesting comments from Clive this morning as well. He never fails to make the news, does he, Nick?
Indeed.
We've got another question here, mate, from Kelly. Is the contribution required for the PPL scheme, I assume it's the coalition scheme, from business, does it apply to businesses whose net income is $5 million or their sales revenue is $5 million?
Look, if I may, I'll take that on notice. I don't have the information in front of me, but I'd happily come back on that one.
All right, Kelly, we will take that on notice. We'll get your details from the system and we'll flick you a response. Now, we've also got one here from Chris up north, where Chris is from. The current policy in relation to federal marine parks is having a big impact on the fishing industry up there. He's asking, what do you think will happen after the election? Will it be changed? Would an ALP government change it, or would a coalition government change it?
Yeah, so unfortunately, in the interest of time, one of the slides that we actually deleted was the slide relating to the creation of the marine park zones across Australia. This was done so by the ALP, and the coalition have committed to addressing that issue. There are a number of eastern seaboard towns in Queensland that potentially stand to be decimated by the creation of those marine park zones, whether it be chartered fishing or general use of those marine park zones. So we're very much aware of the potential negative impact, and the coalition are aware of it too, and they will seek to address it where it's not where they're not appropriate.
Okay, mate, in the interest of time, it looks like we've got our last one here from Tony. What will CCIQ be doing post-election to hold parties to their policies? We did hear you say you would commit to it, Nick. How are you going to go about that?
Look, one of the things that we do well is we articulate what it is that business is telling us, and we take those views to the coalition or to the next federal government. And we're very well placed because we've got a very good membership who tell us and provide us with the information that we need to hear, but more importantly, the information that ultimately the key decision makers, the key stakeholders need to hear. So we will, as has been the case at a state government level, we will put in place very useful communication channels where we sit down and we actually talk to the coalition about how business is performing and what it is that business wants from the federal government, and ensuring that they do deliver on the commitments. And if they don't deliver on the commitments, we'll call them out on it. Just as we called the ALP out on it, just as we're calling out the LNP state government on a few things that they're not following through quick enough.
Okay. Looks like that's all we've got time for, mate. We've got another few questions coming through. We'll endeavour to get back to those in due course. Just a reminder to everybody that we will have these slides sent out and an audio recording of today's webinar, so you can listen to Nick in all his glory again. Thank you for joining us today, Nick. Really appreciate it. And thank you everybody for joining us as well. If you'd like any further information on anything happening at CCIQ, particularly our webinars and roadshows that we will have coming up later in the year, please email us at events@cciq.com.au. I'd also like you to consider the upcoming EcoBiz roadshows and webinars that we're looking at. We're looking at saving businesses money through better management of water, waste and energy. Certainly plenty going on in that area, and if you tuned into our webinar on Tuesday with Dr. Malcolm Roberts from the Queensland Competition Authority, we would be seeing, I guess, that it's in your interest to be looking at your energy consumption, because there is not much bright light in terms of electricity prices at the moment. We're expecting some pretty decent hikes over the next year or two. So please log on to cciq.com.au/events if you would like any more information or to register your interest with those webinars. Thanks again for your time, and we will see you next time.